Good afternoon and good evening to everyone joining us from the region, and welcome again to our very final panel of this conference, this week-long conference at Brookings on the Middle East and the new U.S. administration. Thank you all very much for joining us throughout the week for a very varied and I think very rich program. We look forward to following up with a lot more programming. I'm delighted to be joined with colleagues of mine from Brookings to discuss a few of the lessons learned from this week and also discuss things that we did not cover in our public program. As I said in the very first panel, obviously given the limited time and scheduling reasons, we were not able to discuss all countries or all issues, and we hope to at least touch on them today very briefly, although we'll of course have a lot more research and programming on that in the future. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. and Professor Shibit Elhami of Brookings and the University of Maryland, by Tamara Kaufman-Wittes, Dr. Tamara Kaufman-Wittes as well, from the Brookings Institution, from our center, Dr. Shadi Hamid from our center as well, and later we'll be joined by Bruce Rydell as well. My name is Nathan Sachs, and I'm the director of the center. So I'd like to first just start out with an open sort of question to all of you, and Shibli, I'll start with you if that's okay. Things that stood out by their absence this week in all the various conversations, including the one you had with Anwar Gargash, but others as well.
Thank you, Nathan. Good show this week. I know that there were a lot of issues that weren't covered. A lot of people were not represented, but the cluster was very important, and it led to really important conversations on key issues. One of the things that was striking to me is the conversations about Iran. Obviously, we've had multiple issues because that is a weighty question that is facing the administration at the moment. But it was striking to me that there were differences, particularly between the Israeli representatives and what we were hearing from the Gulf region. It's something that I had certainly noticed in the past, something I've written about before. While Israel and the Gulf Arab states have an interest in containing Iran, a very substantial interest for both of them, they're not identical in interest. And so it was striking to me on the Israeli side that the focus on the military option was prominent, not just by one of the candidates, obviously, Gideon Sar, who obviously said very openly, essentially, that Israel should consider a military option, even if the U.S. opposes it. But even in the discourse of think tankers, where you hear there has to be a credible military option. And that kind of, for me, that was striking, where the Israelis are still focused on that, given where the Biden administration is. But more importantly, because I have a good memory of what happened under the Obama administration. I wrote a piece on this in 2015 in Reuters about how Bibi Netanyahu was trying to show that his threat to attack the Iranian nuclear facility was credible, to urge Obama essentially to act. Initially, the Obama administration didn't take him very seriously. They didn't think this was a credible threat for analytical reasons. They thought it was just a kind of a pressure tactic. But then Netanyahu undertook some measures, including investing huge amounts of money to make the threat credible to the Obama administration. But that got him exactly the opposite of what he wanted. Instead of the administration focusing on a military option, they saw this as an attempt to drag them into a war they didn't want. They made the Iran nuclear issue a top issue, aside from all of the other regional policies that Iran has, and made it the Iran nuclear deal that emerged a top priority in order not to be dragged into a war. So it is kind of interesting to me that the discourse in Israel hasn't changed much, even without Netanyahu and others in the political discourse, still focused on this credibility of the military option. Contrast that with what we heard from people in the UAE, including Gargash that I interviewed, who sounded more like where the Obama administration was. It certainly didn't sound that way when Trump was in office, for sure, but clearly part of their attempt to get closer to the Biden administration. One of the things that was clear is that they would be fine if there was a immediate return to the JCPOA, as long as then as a credible negotiation on things like conventional weapons, Iranian meddling, other issues. We also heard from Kitbi, another UAE think tanker who's close to the authorities, who said, well, Iran wouldn't use its nuclear weapons. These are only deterrence weapons. Their issue wasn't so much the nuclear issue. This has been kind of projected. Of course, the Gulf Arab states are more worried about the conventional capabilities of Iran, as well as Iranian influence, as well as Iranian meddling in Arab affairs, and less focused on the nuclear issue, in contrast to the Israelis. And I wonder how this is going to play itself out in coordinating their relationship with the Biden administration moving forward.
Thanks. Tamara, when I turn to you also for sort of the general question, we'll have opportunity also to discuss and relate to other things that people said, but things that stood out to you, struck you, perhaps surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just on Shibley's point, I think that the fact that this new coalition in the region has a strong sense of shared threat, but a very different set of priorities, is something that we need to keep paying attention to. And it actually offers certain kinds of opportunities for the Biden administration. If, for example, you have all of the Gulf states more focused on Iran's missile program. How do you leverage that in the Security Council to push on that issue, which I think needs a lot of attention. You also actually have more consensus today amongst America's various partners on the need for the nuclear diplomacy to be on a separate track from the diplomacy addressing other dimensions of the Iranian challenge. Back when President Obama was negotiating the JCPOA, that was a bone of contention in the region with the United States approach. So it's interesting where we've come together and where we've come apart. I think overarching the theme across so many of the regional actors that we spoke to this week was diplomacy, hearing the Biden administration's commitment to putting diplomacy first. And as Shibley noted in his interview with Anwar Gargash, the region itself is looking to de-escalate after 10 years in which a lot of regional actors have been very forward-leaning in using military tools and other coercive tools rather than diplomacy themselves. This then begs the question, are these states in the region who have been trying to press their power advantage through military tools, are they ready for diplomacy? Do they have the capacity to engage in effective diplomacy with one another, as well as with the United States and Europe and other crucial external actors? And I think that it's a very different set of governments in the region who have their diplomatic toolbox well developed than who have their military toolbox well developed. So some governments in the region are going to need to up their diplomatic game. That's one thing that occurred to me. The other thing that occurred to me listening to all this is just how far apart some of the regional actors are on the conflicts that the Biden administration wants to make progress on resolving. Israelis and Palestinians, listening to Gideon Sa'ar say, oh no, annexation is still very much in Israel's national interest. Listening to Salam Fayyad question whether the PLO's historic compromise on the 1967 lines is still in the Palestinian interest, to me really drove home just how much the fundamentals of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking have been overturned and how much work there is to do to get the parties back to a baseline where they can begin to negotiate effectively with one another. That was very sobering. And I think that the Biden administration, is not necessarily intent on investing a huge amount of time into diplomacy on Israel-Palestine, on Libya, on Syria, on Yemen. And yet it's clear that diplomacy takes a lot more time than other foreign policy tools. And that leaves a lot more room for second guessing and nitpicking and spoilers. And so it requires more commitment in certain ways than other foreign policy tools. So that just drove home to me the nature of the challenge. Even if all the parties in the region agree on the need for conflict resolution, what it takes to get from point A to point B.
Thank you. Shadi, some lessons learned, something that stood out for you?
Yeah, thanks, Natan. So if I had to sum up the conversations, what I would say is that there was a very strong emphasis on the U.S. managing conflict and preventing bad things from happening, preventing worst case scenarios. So there was a sense that the U.S. is playing, in some sense, a blocking role. Democracy and human rights did come up a number of times, but in a very limited way. That's probably not surprising, but it is somewhat in contrast to how Biden, at least in some of his initial remarks since he's become president, has emphasized what makes him different than Trump. And one of those things is this stronger emphasis on supporting democracy abroad. But obviously supporting democracy abroad and supporting democracy in the Middle East aren't always the same things. And I think what we got a sense from a number of people who spoke this week, whether it was Gregory Meeks or Mark Esper and so on, is that human rights will come up in bilateral conversations, and there will be a desire to at least bring it up in a way that perhaps hadn't happened before under Trump. But it's unclear to me how much further it goes beyond that. So it's countering worst excesses of, say, Saudi Arabia or Egypt, but there isn't really a strong affirmative vision for how we can be more engaged and how we can go beyond just, encouraging Saudi Arabia to be a little bit less repressive. That's good. That's better than what we had before, in my view, but it's not a particularly ambitious vision. And it's almost as if, I would say, that the Arab Spring never happened. You could have listened to many of these conversations, perhaps with the exception of the Algerian foreign minister, in part because Algeria is going through the kind of second iteration of the Arab Spring. But with that notable exception, there's a desire to move beyond and to not necessarily forget, but there's certainly a sense that the Arab Spring isn't particularly relevant today. And that's understandable, certainly. I mean, the Middle East is still quite depressing. There's several ongoing civil conflicts and civil wars. I think from the US perspective, we also have the misfortune of having, shall we say, bad allies that are sometimes reckless, sometimes very much contrary to both our ideals and interests. So I think from how the Biden administration looks at it then is that there's not a lot we can do that's very positive. We can't be particularly transformational. We have to deal with the world as it is. And also, I would say there is this sense of exhaustion with the Middle East. I don't want to overstate there was a Politico article that was brought up by some speakers that came out at the start of the week about how much the Biden administration is deprioritizing the Middle East. We can debate, how accurate that perspective is. But there's no doubt that there's a kind of exhaustion when you hear people talk about the Middle East in this administration, or even in Washington, D.C. more broadly. There's a sense that the Middle East is a nuisance. It's a problem to manage. People are fighting all the time, and the best we can do is make them fight a little bit less. Maybe the last thing I would say is that and I didn't catch every single session, but the ones that I did see, the ones I did watch, religion did not really come up. And that's striking to me because I'm generally someone who's seen the role of Islam in public life as being one of the primary foundational divides in the Middle East. And the fact that many people don't really have much to say about that and don't even really want to talk about it. It's almost being put to the side as something, it's at some level, the US is not good at dealing with religion abroad, but at the same time, it is a reality. It is a point of conflict in a number of different countries. And if we don't have anything to say about that, or we don't have any way to incorporate that into our policy analysis and in our policy recommendations, I think we're going to be at a bit of a loss. So those are just some of the things that stood out to me.
Great, thank you. Bruce, I wonder anything that stood out to you from all the conversations, including yours with the ambassador, but anything else as well?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Good. First of all, thanks to you, Nathan. Pulling together a conference like this anytime is a monumental, difficult task. Trying to do it on Zoom can only be 10 times more difficult. So thank you. I'm in violent agreement with Shadi. I am struck by the lack of ambition, the slowness. This administration understandably has other bigger priorities, especially the president. But the Secretary of State doesn't have other bigger priorities. This is his priority, working on foreign policy. And I fully agree with Shadi too. The Middle East is regarded as a nuisance. I would have used a much stronger word. Nuisance is a nice, relatively neutral way to refer to it. I've heard a lot of old thinking repackaged, and they're not Trump, but that's a low bar. That is a very, very low bar, and it's not going to pass the muster. And it's not going to impress people in the region. I'm going to wait and hear who this entity is that's going to be sanctioned to put pressure on MBS. But I don't think what I heard today is going to pass the mustard on the Hill. And I can assure you it's not going to pass the mustard with the Washington Post, which is not going to say this is a satisfactory response. I also heard very bad analysis of the situation in Saudi Arabia, pathetically bad analysis. The Crown Prince's position is not firm. He's not going to be on the throne for decades to come. That's his propaganda. That's listening to Ali Shahabi. If that's what our embassy is reporting, then we need to get a new embassy out there very, very quickly. So, more broad, my second point was actually a question raised by Tracy in the last session. The era of oil is over. It's over. And it's going to be coming to a complete end much faster. It's not 30 years from now. It's going to be much faster than that. In 10 years, most cars in America will be driven on electricity. The Pentagon is going to make that happen. The Pentagon is about to say that all new vehicles the Pentagon buys has to be electrical cars. That means the biggest purchaser of vehicles in the United States is going to say fossil fuels are finished. That has profound meaning for this region. Tracy nicely said it's one of the things that Middle East exports. Get real. It is the only thing the Middle East exports aside from terrorism. This is a huge, huge thing. And it's hard to get our heads wrapped around it, but it has enormous implications. And they're not good. They're not good implications.
Thank you. So I wonder, I'll chime in. I think I have a slightly different take, I have to say, from Shadi and Bruce. I do hear sort of humble expectations or low expectations from many of the people we heard this week. And I think we hear that in Washington too. And in some ways, I think it's actually rather healthy. This administration is coming after 3 very, very different administrations with a lot of whiplash between them, from George W. Bush to Obama, then to Trump. Each one very different from the other. It's not even that they're Republicans on one side and Democrat on the other. And I think a bit like domestically, where Biden comes in with a sense of predictability and a sense of trying to project unity, I think it's important for our partners in the region also to remember, to understand where America stands with low and even humble expectations of what it can achieve, given the fact the United States is not willing to commit the resources that it did, say, under George W. Bush. And I think that's in many regards. To me, I'm sort of struck, especially on the Iranian question, which is very central and was very central to many of our conversations. First, on things that Shibli and Tamara said, I agree. You know, a panel I moderated on Iran, we heard significant differences between Israeli voices and Emirati voices, and of course, European voices. But I'm also struck by a change in Washington. We heard it from Suzanne, echoing things that we hear in Washington, but we heard it from others as well. There is a movement in Washington, I think, a bit more towards the position of the regional partners, quite different, at least so far in the first month of the Biden administration, quite different from where Obama ended up. We saw that with the announcement of the resumption of the strategic forum between Israel and the United States, and that's significant. I am, though, struck, you know, how long will that last? At the end of the day, there will be a question of sanction relief. Can that kind of comedy between the United States and partners in the region continue? And especially when there will be, and there probably will be, fundamental differences in actual policy. We're also speaking, of course, just after the first strike by the Biden administration in Syria against targets of militias supported by Iran. And all reports suggest that this was carefully chosen to be in Syria, not in Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. And to show, we've heard some voices in the region already pointing out that this shows Biden's willingness to use force in response, at least. It was a very measured use of force. But that, again, to my mind, will be a question going forward. How much will the Biden administration be willing to get involved in such things, especially given the fear of slippery slope?
Yeah. In fact, I would like to engage that a little bit. I mean, what Shadi said and what Bruce said, but to look at it from a slightly different perspective, which is the location of the whole conversation in comparison to where Middle East experts are. As you know, with Mark Lynch, I did a public opinion survey amongst scholars specializing on the Middle East, mostly members of the American Political Science Association, Middle East Studies Association. And there's certainly a disconnect at some level. For example, on the Arab uprising, start with one that Shadi mentioned, the overwhelming majority of Middle East scholars, more than 3/4, think either the uprising haven't gone away or they're coming back within the next 10 years. It's not like they're accepting the fact that, they've been just put in a bottle by the regimes. That's not the way, at least scholars see it. We could debate that, but these are people who say it's still ongoing or they're coming back. We're not addressing that. Those are important issues that have to be discussed. On things related to U.S. power, maybe here there's more harmony. 75% think U.S. power is weaker than it was 10 years ago, is likely to even be weaker in the future. They think of the Middle East right now in terms of global power as more as sort of multipolar, with no one, including the U.S., dominating influence in the region. They think on the Iran nuclear issue, the vast majority, 2/3, say the U.S. should join the JCPOA immediately without renegotiation. On Israel-Palestine, the administration is focused on the two-state solution. We're talking about that still. 52% of the scholars think it's no longer possible, and another, large percentage think it's unlikely in the next 10 years. There are a handful of people who think it's still likely in the next 10 years. So there's a little bit of disconnect between where the scholars are and the conversation that is taking place in Washington. It doesn't mean the scholars are always right. We know that there are differences and the scholars could be wrong, but it does strike me that we're, we have there is still a Washington bubble or policymaking bubble, even beyond Washington, global bubble, disconnected from some analytical assessment that is necessary, particularly on the big issues of the day.
Natan, can I jump in on that? You know, I wouldn't disagree with Shibley that there's a bubble in Washington on various issues. And more broadly, I think that Washington tends to fixate on certain issues and give relatively short shrift to others. And Shadi and Bruce, I think, pointed that out very well. So right now, the fixation in the Washington policy conversation is on Iran, and it's a big challenge and a hard one, and there's lots to talk about. But I think that one of the things that's happened over the last decade is that in the analytic community broadly, not just in academic analysis, but that there has grown a greater consensus about the relationship between governance, social cohesion, and stability. You know, when I was writing about the Bush administration's freedom agenda, Middle East Studies was analyzing the durability of Arab authoritarianism. And this week, the same week as our conference, the Rand Corporation released a major study of the Middle East, one of the themes of which is that human security and human development and governance issues are core to the stability of the region. So I hear what Shibley's saying, but I don't think we should overstate the disconnect. I actually think that there is much more consensus today than there ever has been before, including inside the US government, on the need for stability in the region to be thought of not merely in geostrategic terms, but in terms of human security. And the Biden administration so far has sort of talked a good talk on that, but I think we have yet to see how they're going to walk the walk. And you know, I'm curious to watch that.
To me also, that there's an interesting question of both goals and means. So on the one hand, you do see, I think, a growing consensus in the United States, and I think certainly all of us at Brookings are party to that, of a need to look at fundamentals. If you think long-term in the Middle East, there are enormous problems that will affect hundreds of millions of people, well beyond the immediate relations between two governments right now. Questions that Bruce raised also of climate change and their effects, but even before climate change, just the lack of basic governance and the lack of economic opportunity, which are enormous and affect huge numbers of people. And that recognition, I think, is extremely important and very welcome to my mind. On the other hand, we also have an era, and we can't ignore it, of the United States willing and perhaps able to commit much fewer resources to change things in the Middle East. And most of these problems that we're talking about do not entail a speech by a principal or a simple decision in the White House. They entail an enormous effort by the United States, and even that would not be enough. Even that would have to be only part, probably a small part, of a much broader effort, and most of it organic from within, from the region itself. And so to a certain degree, I'm heartened by the fact that there is, I think, a longer view among many. But I have to say I remain rather pessimistic. Some of the problems are gargantuan and will not be changed certainly by whether Biden decides X, Y, or Z on priority, on a low priority after all. Shadi, you were on the queue already, and Bruce, I'll turn to you right after that.
Yeah, so, you know, on Tamara's point, I remember when I would talk to Obama administration officials in the second term, and they would certainly, from an intellectual standpoint, they would agree with a lot of this idea that governance is important, democracy is in America's long-term interest, because if you include people in the political process, then that can reduce conflict, reduce the resort to violence. So I think that there is an intellectual consensus if you talk to people on a broad level. Also, it's very hard. It's very hard to say that democracy wouldn't be good in the long run. So I think there's also like a natural tendency just to say that. But what I found is that the disconnect was between that intellectual realization on the part of the Obama administration, what they were actually willing to do in terms of policy. And knowing some of the folks who have been appointed to the Biden administration, I know that they personally agree, again, from an intellectual standpoint, democratization is good for stability in the long run. But the fact that that intellectual realization doesn't actually lead to bold policy in that direction, to me, is it's not a puzzle, but it is, in my view, a problem. And this goes, I think, to the question of US power and perceptions of US leverage, because oftentimes the claim was that, yes, this would be nice in theory, but the US doesn't have a lot of power to actually change outcomes in the internal domestic politics of these countries. But, there are certain things, and Bruce has written quite a bit about this. If we wanted to really put pressure on Saudi Arabia, there are things that we could do that wouldn't require an excessive use of US power. In fact, it would require drawing back a little bit. So, for example, suspending the provision of spare parts and maintenance to the Saudi military and to the Air Force in particular, that could ground the Saudi Air Force in fairly short order. Now, that is not something that would be realistically considered by the current Biden administration, just too controversial, and they want to be pragmatic. But theoretically, these things can be done if there was sufficient will. That wouldn't necessarily go beyond the capabilities of US power or US resources.
Tammy used a good phrase. They talk the talk. The question is, can they walk the walk? I would add to one other element to that. The time to take bold action in an administration is the first 100 days. After that, the political constraints on you are going to build and build and build and build. And I think they're wasting their time. In particular, I would say on Iran. A slow dance with the Iranians is going to end up producing an outcome that will be very, very controversial, not just on partisan lines. If you remember back to the JCPOA debate, Obama had a hard time getting the Democratic Party behind it. And in parts of it, he never got behind it. I think they will rue that they didn't move much faster on a couple of these issues. I would say Iran in particular. They've just built up opposition. They're going to find the Iranians be what the Iranians always are, extremely clever negotiators who know how to bury you in obfuscation and stuff like that. We'll see. Maybe slow and steady will win the race. We'll see.
Great. So I actually find myself more in the slow and steady camp, I have to admit. And we had a very interesting discussion just on this point on how much the United States should take into account the upcoming presidential elections in Iran in May or June, where Suzanne Maloney, our own Suzanne Maloney, was on one side, and some of the other experts, especially Elie Maya from ECFR, and another where she advocated taking that very much into account and trying to move fast before that. I'd like to shift to one last sort of topic, and that is to combine things that we didn't cover and that we should, but especially things that are probably not on the radar of the Biden administration. So this is a bit unfair, but I guess that's our job, is to try and think of what we might discuss a year or two from now that we're probably not thinking of too much at the moment. So let's set Iran and Saudi Arabia aside for a moment. What else might we be discussing that is simply not on our plate? Tammy, why don't we start with you, if I may?
I think there are very few things that are nowhere on the radar of the Biden administration because the US government is large and capable and has specialists on every conceivable issue. The question is whether it gets attention at the highest levels in time to head off negative developments. And, this gets more broadly to the point that Bruce was making, which is that if you don't see over the horizon, you tend to devalue a thing And then it becomes a crisis and you're forced to deal with it in ways that you wouldn't wish to. I think that is the broad challenge. Whether we're talking about ongoing bottom-up protests across the region, and Shadi's absolutely right. This is a story that we are very much in the middle of, and I don't know where we'll see the end. So things like, politics in Lebanon and Algeria and Iraq that have to remain important considerations, and shouldn't be traded off against other conversations that we're having on geopolitical issues in the region. I would say the same thing about the conflict in Syria. We just had this wonderful panel discussion about the challenge of conflict resolution in the region. But, even if it's hard and even if we feel like our leverage is limited, that doesn't mean that we can accept a situation in which a conflict blows up and throws off the negative externalities that we've seen over the last decade. I think one place that I would point to in specific in that regard that we didn't talk about at all this week, I think, but that really needs urgent attention is the Horn of Africa, where we're seeing a number of regional actors, Middle Eastern actors, whether it's Egypt or the UAE, playing a role. There are ongoing conflicts that are already quite bad and could easily get worse, that could impede major American goals like confronting terrorism in the Sahel. And so if our regional partners are truly interested in diplomacy and de-escalation, I would love to see them apply that principle in the Horn with much more alacrity than we've seen so far.
Great, and I'll just plug before turning on. I'll just plug. We've had some great work on this, especially by our former colleague Zach Verton, who has now joined the administration, but also by our colleague Wanda Felber-Brown and Jeff Feltman, of course, who've done excellent work and written on the Horn of Africa. It's a very extremely important issue, considering the number of people also living there and the potential for true catastrophe. But even short of catastrophe, we already have a brewing crisis that really deserves a lot of attention. And I'll just channel one of our colleagues by saying there is a bit of an administrative difficulty because it sort of lies in between the MENA space and the Africa space. And for bureaucracy, that's not always an easy thing to do, to sort of bridge exactly the seams. And so a very important topic to watch. Shadi, over to you. Same question.
Yeah, so Natan, I guess I would say just so people know where I'm coming from, I have a bit of a bias. I don't believe that autocracy can be permanent. By definition, autocracies are temporary because, for a variety of reasons. One of them is just they sort of go contrary to what I consider to be part of the human spirit, which is difficult to extinguish entirely. So what that means, though, is, first of all, what is the long-term perspective? And what do we actually envision the Middle East looking like? Maybe not in 5 years, but in 20 or 30. And I bring this up because I'm skeptical that there will be revolutions or successful uprisings in the near term. I don't think that that's something the Biden administration has to worry about right away, because unfortunately, and I hate to say this, repression can work. Not in the long term, but it can be quite effective in the short to medium term, where you basically rebuild the wall of fear. And folks might remember there was this discourse when the Arab Spring started that Arabs will never go back to the way things were before. The wall of fear has been broken down. But what we realize is that the wall of fear can be rebuilt brick by brick, if you will. And if we look, for example, at Algeria had its military coup in 91, a brutal civil war subsequently. It took Algeria about 25 years to recover, where Algerians were able and willing to go back into the streets. In Syria, after the Hama massacre of 1982, it took about 29 years for Syrians to build back the courage to challenge the Assad regime. What that tells me is that these are basically generational problems. So Egypt, I think, is a disaster waiting to happen, but not right away. But I do think there will come a point where US policymakers will have to pay a little bit more attention to Egypt, because this situation doesn't seem sustainable. But the question is always, when we say that the status quo is unsustainable, which is something that everyone loves saying, and I remember during the second Bush administration in the 2000s, Condoleezza Rice would always say things like, the status quo is untenable, which is true, but the problem is we don't agree when it becomes untenable. So that's where Egypt comes in a bit of a longer term. Tunisia, I may have missed it. I don't think Tunisia really came up. I guess people don't care a whole lot about Tunisia because they see it as being somewhat positive, and we have a bias towards not looking too closely at countries that are doing better than the others, because there's not a huge crisis in Tunisia now, but there are weak points. There are things we have to be worried about. And I would also mention that I don't think that I heard, and as someone who works on the Muslim Brotherhood, I obviously pay more attention to whether the Muslim Brotherhood is mentioned. I think Anwar Gargash mentioned briefly political Islam, but there is a broader context here where we have two blocs in the Middle East. I mean, one of them now is more powerful than the others: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt to some extent, and in cooperation with Israel. They are what we might call the anti-brotherhood or anti-Islamist bloc, but then you have Qatar and Turkey, which are more sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood. And that gets to a bigger conversation around the role of Islam vis-a-vis the state and the state's relationship to Islam. And that still is, I think, a subtext to some of the tensions that we have in the region. I mean, obviously the Qatar crisis has been resolved, well, not completely resolved, but to some extent resolved for now. But what was one thing that was driving that? Fundamentally different conceptions of the relationship between Islam and the state.
Thank you, Bruce. The same question. Issues we're not thinking about at all right now, and maybe high on the Biden administration's agenda in a couple of years.
It's a very good question. I call it the looking for the canary in the mine. Where's the tipping point that starts to show you that something's coming? And here's what I think. Lebanon, in many ways, is the canary. It's a small state. It doesn't have any oil, and it was confronting all the problems of the Arab Spring coming home with one of the most corrupt, not just governments, but governing classes. So, where are the other canaries in the Middle East? I would say it's going to be states somewhat similar to Lebanon. Small, relatively small states that don't have any oil and have too many people. One that comes to my mind right away, Jordan. Jordan, I see the signs of the canary. I see signs there already. COVID covers it up. COVID does a very good job of allowing, COVID is a force multiplier for repression. Because, first of all, nobody in their right mind would go out and get into a demonstration with a lot of other people who don't have any masks on when you know you could die from them breathing on you, let alone the government opening fire on you with machine guns. As COVID eases up in places like Jordan, I think we may start to see more signs of social unrest and unhappiness. COVID has also accelerated the sense that the haves get the vaccine and the have-nots don't get the vaccine. Another place, Bahrain. Bahrain has been under repression now for not a decade. I was first had stones thrown at my convoy in Bahrain in 1994. This is a country that's, it's only kept in power by the boots of the Saudi National Guard. Oman, another country, has some oil, but not very much. It has a population that's too large, and it doesn't have the magic of Sultan Qaboos anymore. I would be looking at little places like that. See if a year from now, once COVID is, I wouldn't say gone away, but under control, how do those places manage? Algeria doesn't quite fit, but in some ways it is the first canary. As Shadi rightly said, they had the first Arab Spring back in the 1990s, and now they're having another Algerian Spring, but which COVID has pushed to the side. The last thing I would say, Natan, and I'm sure this is impossible to do, but I'd love to find a way to do it. There were several times in this conference, and I'll mention one in particular, when I really wanted to be able to have like a small chat room where our guests didn't hear what you said. You said, in essence, what he or she is really saying is this, but they're kind of hiding it under that. And I'll give you an example.
You are correct. We will not be able to do that.
Ambassador Kumar, who very impressive, articulate, a class act. When I asked her about Yemen, she went on and on about the UN Security Council resolution. Well, the UN Security Council resolution is a disaster. It's one of the biggest reasons we don't have peace in Yemen. And of course, she's the author of this UN Security Council resolution, but she didn't want to say that. She implicitly hinted at it at one point when she said Jordan was president of the Security Council when it was passed. Yes, Madam Ambassador, and you were the permanent rep of Jordan who was pushing it forward. Despite the fact that many people in the UK and in the US mission knew this was a bad mistake. Basically, the Jordanians pimped for the Saudis, what they were told. Yes, I know I can't think of a way to do it. I'm struggling with thinking of a way to do it. Maybe there could be a secret chat room down on the bottom somewhere. But it would be fun, that's for sure. Of course, wouldn't get very many repeat guests.
No, we wouldn't. Shibli, I thank you for overcoming technical troubles in this Zoom era we're in, so we can hear you, I think. And our final question for you is, and we can see you too.
Yeah, now I figured out using another camera. I'm sorry about the technology. My laptop completely crashed, so I'm using a backup.
The good news about this year is that we all understand. Our final question is if you think there is something that is not just on the conference agenda, but on the Biden administration's agenda at the moment, that is not on their agenda at the moment, and likely will be, or perhaps will be in a year or two, that is worth spotlighting at the moment.
Well, I think just let me take this question a little bit differently, because I heard what Bruce said about sort of this administration not being ambitious, not ambitious enough about the agenda in the Middle East, and I, at some level, of course, I agree with it 100%, especially given what we've heard, the limits of what was put on the table. But on the other hand, realistically, I'm not sure how much energy this administration is likely to spend on issues to get them done in the Middle East. I am reminded about the role, during the Obama administration when they made the Arab-Israeli issue seemingly a priority issue, though not in practice. I think at least rhetorically and setting the mood for pursuing that peace from day one of the Obama administration, how even with that, they didn't put enough into it to make it happen. And now, obviously, we're in a far worse shape than we were during the Obama administration on this, with far more urgent priorities. I'm not sure what could be done in this particular case. But I do think that the broader question about advocacy of human rights in the Middle East, which is something that obviously this administration is doing rhetorically, in the end, what will that mean? For now, it's a rhetorical conversation that they're having with leaders in the region, and they are, to their credit, doing it and doing it publicly in some cases. But then if you're not going to tie any action related to it, how meaningful is that? How is this going to impact not only how the region looks at us, but how credible this is going to be? I think that there are urgent priorities pertaining to humanitarian aid that we're going to face immediately in a way that I'm not sure that Congress is going to be open to it, given all of the domestic priorities, including aid that is going to be necessary for Yemen, for Libya, for Iraq, for the Syrian refugees. I also don't think we're taking the refugee issue as a top priority. We have seen. We talk about it obviously as a humanitarian issue, but it's also a political issue. We've got millions of refugees that were created by the Iraq War and then the civil war, particularly in Syria, and certainly in addition to the Palestinian refugees, that are not just humanitarian issues. They're really political issues as well that are going to need more urgent attention. I don't see that stated in the priorities of the administration.
Thank you so much, everyone. And in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap. So I'm just going to say a few more words, which is that our whole agenda, of course, can be found at the Brookings website, brookings.edu. And very soon we'll have videos for all our different sessions available there. So you'll be able to visit and revisit them and critique everything that we said. I want to also just turn by thanking first everyone here on this panel, my colleagues here, Shadi Hamid and Bruce Rydell and Tamara Wittes and Shirley Tilhami, but also all our colleagues at the Center for Middle East Policy and in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, headed by Suzanne Maloney, and Brookings in general, headed by John Allen. In particular, this whole week, of course, cannot be possible without enormous work by people behind the scenes. And so I'd like to name a few who did an enormous amount of work for this, and my deep gratitude is owed to them: Rachel Slattery and Ted Reinert, and Anna Newby, who heads the communications team in foreign policy, and Ed Berkey, who heads all our AV team and keeps us running, which is really not a simple thing to do in this day and age. And Adriana Pita and Andrea Risotto, who heads the communications team at Brookings writ large, and Kevin Huggard, who works very closely with many of us, and Nikki Sullivan, who keeps us running. And the people who are literally at the moment keeping us up, and those are Suzanne Schaefer and Harold Dalling and Trevor Bryan. And I'd like to ask the last, but certainly not the least, to join us for a moment on the screen. And that's really been my partner in organizing, not just in keeping us running here, but in organizing. It's a platitude to say that, but Isra Saber will be able to attest that I consulted her on absolutely every single item of this agenda, putting together the agenda, thinking of how to do it, confronting a million different problems with the cleverness and the ability and the skill. And we're just extremely fortunate to have you, Isra. Thank you for keeping us running. I'm envious of the law school that will steal you from us. Isra, thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure, Natan. Working with such incredible people makes it much easier.
Thank you, Isra, and thank you all very much for an interesting week. Please tune in for our future programming and especially our research at brookings.edu. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you all in the region and the United States and everywhere else for joining us. Thanks and goodbye.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.